Imagine this, you're 67 years old, richer than you ever dreamed, and you've got a craving for young men that just won't quit. 4 marriages down, 4 divorces signed. But this time feels different. His name is Eric, and he's 33 years old with smooth skin, bright eyes, and a smile that makes you feel like you're 25 again. He calls you baby, holds your hand in public, makes love to you like you're the only woman in the world. But here's the thing about playing with fire when you're made of money. Sometimes, the flames turn on you. You see, Eric wasn't just looking for love, he was looking for a payday. And when a rich woman with a weak heart stands between a young man and millions of dollars, well, let's just say some folks will do whatever it takes to speed up the inheritance process. What happened next wasn't just murder. It was betrayal dressed up in sweet words and gentle touches. It was greed wearing the mask of devotion. It was a love story that ended with a funeral, and a bank account that suddenly had a new owner. If you're ready for a story about money manipulation and what happens when sugar turns bitter, hit that subscribe button and buckle up. This tale of a sugar mama and her deadly young lover will leave you questioning everything you thought you knew about love, trust, and the price people pay for both. Margaret Hayes had more money than she knew what to do with, and less sense than a teenager in love. At 67, she owned 3 houses, 2 businesses, and a heart that just couldn't seem to learn its lesson. This woman had buried 2 husbands, divorced 2 more, and still believed somewhere out there was a man who would love her for more than just her bank account. Margaret wasn't born rich. She grew up poor in rural Tennessee, picking cotton until her fingers bled, and her back bent like a question mark. But she was smart. Smart enough to get herself through nursing school. Smart enough to marry her first husband, a doctor, who taught her about investments while she managed his practice. And smart enough to keep every penny when he died of a heart attack at just 45. That was marriage number 1, a love story that ended with a life insurance check and a lesson: money meant freedom. Marriage number 2 was calculated. A real estate developer who doubled her money before drinking himself to death. Marriage number 3 was loneliness. A retired judge who gave her respectability but died in his sleep after 5 boring years. Marriage number 4 was desperation. A younger man, just 55, who took half her money in the divorce and taught her that age didn't always mean wisdom. Now, at 67, Margaret lived alone in a mansion in Nashville, Tennessee, with more rooms than she knew what to do with and more money than she could spend in 3 lifetimes. Her children, all grown up and living their own lives in different states, called on holidays, visited at Christmas, and worried about their mother's habit of falling for the wrong men. But Margaret wasn't worried about right or wrong. She was worried about being lonely. That's how she ended up on sugarmatch.com at 2 a.m. on a Tuesday night, typing out a profile that lied about her age by 10 years and told the truth about her bank account. Successful businesswoman seeks companionship with younger men. Age is just a number. Money is not an issue. Looking for someone who appreciates the finer things in life and knows how to treat a lady like a queen. She posted pictures from 5 years ago, added a few inches to her height, and subtracted a few pounds from her weight. She hit submit, and waited. The messages started coming in within hours. Most were obvious scammers, boys young enough to be her grandsons, asking for gift cards and plane tickets. But one message was different. Hello, beautiful. My name is Eric. I'm 33. I work in construction and also model on Instagram. I believe age is just a number when 2 hearts connect. I'd love to take you to dinner and show you that chivalry isn't dead. A woman like you deserves to be treated like royalty. Eric Johnson looked like trouble wrapped in a work shirt. 6 feet tall, brown skin smooth as honey, arms that spoke of honest work, and a smile that made Margaret feel things she hadn't felt since her 20s. His profile said he was a foreman for a construction company, a single father to an 8-year-old daughter, looking for something real. Their first date was at the fanciest restaurant in Nashville. Eric showed up in a suit that probably cost more than he made in a month. But Margaret didn't care. He opened doors, pulled out chairs, listened when she talked, and laughed at her jokes like they were the funniest things he'd ever heard. "You're not like other women I've dated," he said over dessert, his hand covering hers across the table. "How so?" Margaret asked, her heart beating like a drum in her chest. "You're real confident. You know who you are and what you want. That's sexy as hell." Margaret blushed like a schoolgirl. When was the last time someone called her sexy? When was the last time someone looked at her like she was beautiful instead of rich? The check came to $400. Eric reached for his wallet, but Margaret waved him away. "Please," she said. "This is my treat. I can't let you pay for everything." "Baby," she said, the word slipping out before she could stop it. "I asked you out. This one's on me." Eric smiled that smile that made her knees weak and her common sense disappear. They dated for 3 months before she invited him to move in. 3 months of dinners, movies, and long drives through the Tennessee countryside. 3 months of Eric telling her she was beautiful, smart, funny, perfect. 3 months of feeling like a woman instead of just a bank account with legs. "I don't want to rush anything," Eric said when she offered him the guest bedroom in her mansion. "But my lease is up next month, and my baby girl needs a stable place to stay when she visits." "Bring her too," Margaret said without thinking. "This house is too big for just me anyway." And that's how Eric Johnson and his 8-year-old daughter, Leah, moved into Margaret's mansion on Maple Street. And that's when Margaret learned the difference between love and performance. Eric was perfect. Too perfect. He never left dishes in the sink or clothes on the floor. He never watched TV too loud or forgot to say please and thank you. He brought her flowers every Friday and told her she looked beautiful even when she woke up with her hair standing sideways and her makeup smeared. But perfection, Margaret started to realize, wasn't always real. She noticed small things first. The way Eric's eyes went cold when he thought she wasn't looking. How he answered his phone in another room and spoke in whispers. The expensive clothes that kept appearing in his closet, clothes that cost more than a construction worker should be able to afford. When she asked about it, Eric talked about everything. His ex-wife's child support. The money he'd been saving for years. His mama, he said, about the phone calls. She worries about him. "You spoil me too much," he said about the clothes. "I'm not used to having nice things." Margaret wanted to believe him. Needed to believe him. Because the alternative, admitting that she was being played again, was too painful to accept. But late at night, when Eric thought she was asleep, she heard him on the phone. Words like patience and almost there and won't be much longer. Words that made her stomach turn and her heart break. Still, she said nothing. Because saying something meant facing the truth. And the truth was something Margaret wasn't ready for. Not yet. Eric Johnson wasn't his real name. It was the name on the fake ID he'd bought for $500 from a man who asked no questions and gave no guarantees. His real name was Thomas Miles, and he had a different kind of resume than the one he'd shown Margaret. 3 arrests for theft, 2 for fraud, and 1 conviction that got him 18 months in county jail, and a lesson in how the system worked. Rich people had money, poor people had nothing, and smart people figured out how to transfer wealth from one group to the other. Thomas had been running cons since he was 16. He started small, fake charity collections outside grocery stores, selling warranty extensions door-to-door, credit card skimming at gas stations. But those were nickel and dime games. What he wanted was the big score. The one that would set him up for life. That's when he discovered sugarmatch.com and the women who used it. Lonely, older women with more money than sense. Women who wanted to feel young again, beautiful again, desired again, women who would pay anything for the illusion of love. Thomas had perfected his approach over 2 years and 5 different targets. He studied their profiles like a scientist, learned their weaknesses, their fears, their dreams. Then he became exactly what they needed. For the lonely divorced teacher in Biloxi, he was a struggling artist who needed someone to believe in his talent. For the widowed restaurant owner in Mobile, he was a veteran with PTSD who needed someone to heal his broken heart. For the bitter socialite in Nat Shea, he was a bad boy with a good heart who needed someone to save him from himself. Each relationship lasted just long enough to get access to bank accounts, credit cards, or valuable items. Then he disappeared, usually with enough money to last 6 months while he planned the next score. But Margaret was different. Margaret was the jackpot. Thomas spent 3 weeks studying her before making contact. Her social media showed a woman with money and loneliness in equal measure. Photos of empty dinner tables set for 2. Caption, about looking forward to finding my person. Check-ins at expensive restaurants with the comment, dining alone again. She was perfect. The Eric Johnson persona was built specifically for her. A construction worker because she'd posted about appreciating men who work with their hands. A single father because she'd shared articles about the importance of strong father figures. Younger, but not too young. 33 was old enough to seem mature, but young enough to make her feel special. Even the daughter was calculated. Thomas had borrowed Kesha from his sister, promising her $200 and a weekend at Six Flags if she played along. 8-year-old Kesha thought it was a game, called Miss Dorothy, and hugged her like she meant it. She asked for bedtime stories that made the old woman's eyes water with joy. She's perfect, Margaret told her friend Beatrice over lunch at the country club. Eric is perfect. I feel like I'm living in a fairy tale. Thomas made sure she felt that way. He studied her routines, her preferences, her moods. Learned that she liked her coffee with 2 sugars and no cream. That she watched old movies on Sunday afternoons and cried during the sad parts. That she took heart medication every morning and sleeping pills every night. Most importantly, he learned about her money. Margaret was worth $12 million, not counting the real estate. Most of it was in stocks and bonds, but she kept $2 million in checking accounts for easy access. She had no will, kept saying she needed to get around to it, which meant everything would go to her children when she died unless she had a husband. In Mississippi, a spouse automatically inherited a third of everything, no matter what anyone said. That's when Thomas' plan shifted from theft to something much more permanent. The proposal happened on a Tuesday night in November, exactly 6 months after their first date. Thomas had spent the day setting the scene. Candles throughout the house, rose petals on the stairs, her favorite song playing softly in the background. Margaret came home from her book club to find him waiting in the living room, down on one knee with a ring that had cost him $15,000 of her own money. Margaret Hayes, he said, his voice shaking with what she thought was emotion, but was actually adrenaline. You've made me the happiest man alive. Will you marry me? Margaret said yes before he even finished the question. They were married 3 weeks later at the courthouse, with Kesha as their only witness. Margaret wore a white dress that cost $3,000 and a smile that made her look 20 years younger. Thomas wore a black suit and a wedding ring that felt like handcuffs. The honeymoon was a week in the Bahamas, where Margaret posted pictures of herself and her handsome husband on every social media platform she had. The comments were mixed: congratulations from acquaintances, concerns from friends, and radio silence from her children. But Margaret didn't care. She was married to a man who loved her, who chose her, who made her feel alive again. What she didn't know was that her new husband had already started planning her funeral. Marriage changed things, but not in the way Margaret expected. Eric, she still called him Eric, became attentive to the point of suffocation. He made her breakfast every morning, brought her pills with a glass of fresh orange juice, and watched her take them like a nurse monitoring a patient. Just making sure my baby stays healthy, he said when she asked about it. He took over the household finances to take some stress off her shoulders, hired a new accountant who asked fewer questions, opened joint bank accounts that required both signatures, but somehow always had Eric handling the paperwork. Margaret noticed the changes but explained them away. This was what marriage looked like when you found the right person. Someone who cared enough to take care of everything. Someone who loved you enough to worry about your health. But love wasn't what was making. Eric was so attentive to her pill schedule. Margaret took 3 medications every day: blood pressure pills, cholesterol medication, and a blood thinner prescribed after a minor heart episode 2 years earlier. The blood thinner was important. It kept her blood from clotting, which prevented strokes and heart attacks. It also made her more vulnerable to bleeding. Much more vulnerable. Eric had spent hours researching her medications online, reading medical journals and forum posts about drug interactions, overdoses, and side effects. What he learned was that too much blood thinner could be fatal, especially when combined with certain other substances. The plan was elegant in its simplicity: increase her blood thinner dosage gradually over several weeks. Not enough to cause immediate symptoms, but enough to thin her blood to dangerous levels. Then introduce a trigger, something that would cause internal bleeding that her compromised blood couldn't clot to stop. It would look like a medical emergency, a tragic accident. A woman whose heart medication couldn't save her from the inevitable. Eric started by switching her pills. Margaret took 5 milligrams of blood thinner daily. Eric began giving her 10 milligrams, using pills he ordered online from a pharmacy that didn't ask for prescriptions. The pills looked identical. Margaret never noticed. Within 2 weeks, she was bruising more easily. Small bumps that should have left no mark were leaving purple spots on her arms and legs. "I must be getting old," she joked, showing Eric a bruise on her wrist. "Used to be I could walk into a door and not even mark up." "Maybe you should see the doctor," Eric suggested, his voice full of false concern. "For a few bruises?" she asked, brushing it off. "Baby, I'm 67 years old. My body's just doing what old bodies do." Eric nodded sympathetically while mentally calculating how much longer he needed to wait. 3 weeks into the plan, Margaret started having dizzy spells. She'd stand up too fast and have to grab onto furniture to keep from falling. Twice, she nearly collapsed while climbing the stairs. "I think something's wrong with my medication," she told Eric over dinner. "I feel off." "Want me to call your doctor?" Eric asked. No. I probably just need to adjust the dosage. I'll call tomorrow." But Eric made sure she didn't make it to tomorrow. That night, after Margaret took her sleeping pill and kissed him goodnight, Eric waited until her breathing became deep and regular. Then he went to the kitchen and opened the bottle of aspirin he'd been keeping in the cabinet. Aspirin was a blood thinner too. Not as strong as Margaret's prescription medication, but powerful enough when combined with the overdose she'd already been taking. Eric crushed 15 aspirin tablets into powder, mixed it with a small amount of water, and added it to the orange juice he would serve her with breakfast. The combination of medications would thin her blood to the point where any internal bleeding would be unstoppable, and Eric had already planned how to trigger that bleeding. Margaret's morning routine was predictable. She woke up at 7 a.m., went to the bathroom, then came downstairs for breakfast. She always wore slippers, soft-soled house shoes that she had had for 10 years and refused to throw away, despite Eric's offers to buy her new ones. Those slippers were about to become the murder weapon. While Margaret was in the bathroom, Eric went to the top of the stairs and sprayed the 3rd step with cooking oil. Just a light mist, enough to make the wood slippery but not enough to be obvious. Then he went back to the kitchen and waited. Margaret came downstairs the same way she had every morning for the past year. She held the handrail with her left hand and walked slowly, carefully. But when her slipper hit the oil on the 3rd step, her foot shot out from under her. She tumbled down 13 wooden steps, her head hitting the banister twice and her body twisting in ways that human bodies weren't meant to twist. Eric found her at the bottom of the stairs, conscious but bleeding from a gash on her head and complaining that she couldn't feel her legs. "Oh my God, baby!" he shouted loud enough for the neighbors to hear. "What happened? Are you okay?" Margaret tried to speak, but blood was filling her mouth. The combination of blood thinners and the trauma from the fall was causing massive internal bleeding. Her body couldn't clot the blood fast enough to stop it. Eric called 911, performed CPR for the paramedics to see, and rode in the ambulance, holding Margaret's hand while she died. At the hospital, doctors worked for 3 hours trying to save her. But the bleeding was too severe, her blood too thin, her body too broken. Margaret died at 2:47 p.m. on a Thursday afternoon, surrounded by machines that couldn't help her and a husband who had killed her. The cause of death was ruled accidental, traumatic brain injury and internal bleeding caused by a fall down the stairs. The medical examiner noted that her blood work showed elevated levels of blood thinner but attributed it to medication error rather than foul play. Eric cried at the funeral, real tears, because he'd actually grown fond of Margaret in his own way. But not fond enough to choose her life over $4 million. Because that's what he inherited as her surviving spouse. $4 million, plus the house, plus the businesses. Everything Margaret had worked for, saved for, lived for, everything was his now. Thomas Miles thought he was untouchable. He had a new identity, a dead wife, and more money than he'd ever dreamed of. The perfect crime, perfectly executed. But perfection has a way of creating its own problems. The first issue was Margaret's children. David and Patricia Miles had been suspicious of Eric from the beginning. Their mother had a history of bad relationships, But this one felt different, worse, more dangerous. They tried to talk to her about it during Christmas dinner, 6 weeks before she died. "Mama, you barely know this man," Patricia had said. "And now you're married to him? What's the rush?" "The rush is that I'm 67 years old, and I've wasted enough time being alone," Margaret replied. "Eric makes me happy. Isn't that what matters?" "What matters is that he might be after your money," David added. "Have you thought about that?" Margaret had gotten angry then, told them they were jealous, ungrateful, and bitter. She said they'd rather see her die alone than find happiness with someone they didn't approve of. It was the last real conversation they had before she died. Now, sitting in a lawyer's office hearing about their mother's estate, David and Patricia felt sick with guilt and rage. They'd been right about Eric, but being right didn't bring their mother back. According to Mississippi law, the estate attorney explained, surviving spouses are entitled to 1/3 of the deceased assets, regardless of any existing will. Since Mrs. Hayes died without a will and since she was legally married to Mr. Johnson, he inherits everything, except for a small statutory allowance for her children. Everything? Patricia asked. $4 million in liquid assets, plus the house, plus ownership stakes in 2 businesses. "I'm sorry for your loss, but the law is clear," the estate attorney explained. David and Patricia left the lawyer's office knowing they'd lost more than just their mother. They'd lost their inheritance, their family home, and their sense of justice. But they weren't ready to give up. The second issue was money. Eric had thought that inheriting $4 million would solve all his problems. What he didn't realize was that having $4 million would create new ones. Large inheritances trigger automatic reviews by the IRS. Eric's tax history as a construction worker was thin, barely 2 years of construction worker wages. Suddenly inheriting millions of dollars raised red flags. Bank transfers over $10,000 require federal reporting. When Eric tried to move money to offshore accounts, those transfers got flagged too. Most importantly, Eric didn't understand the difference between being rich and acting rich. Within 6 months of Margaret's death, he bought a $200,000 car, a $500,000 house in California, and a boat he couldn't even drive. He was spending money faster than he could hide it, leaving a trail that forensic accountants could follow from space. The investigation started small. A welfare check on an 8-year-old who'd been telling strange stories about her fake daddy. A tax audit on a construction worker who'd suddenly become a millionaire. A routine review of an accidental death involving an elderly woman and her much younger husband. But small investigations have a way of becoming big ones when they all point to the same person. 6 months after Margaret's death, Eric Johnson was arrested at a casino in Las Vegas, where he'd been living under the name Eric Johnson and losing Margaret's money as fast as he could count it. The charges were murder in the first degree, fraud, identity theft, and conspiracy to commit murder. The evidence was overwhelming. Pharmacy records showing online purchases of blood-thinning medication. Bank records showing suspicious financial activity. Medical records showing Margaret's blood work on the day she died. And an 8-year-old witness who could describe exactly how Uncle Mike had taught her to pretend to be his daughter. But the strongest evidence was Eric himself. When confronted with the facts, he didn't deny them. He didn't lawyer up. He didn't claim innocence. Instead, he shrugged and said, "She was going to die anyway. I just helped it happen a little faster. And she was happy when she died. Isn't that worth something?" It wasn't. The trial of Eric Johnson lasted 3 weeks. Not because the crime was particularly unusual. Men killing women for money happens every day in America, but because of the details. The fake identity. The borrowed child. The elderly victim who'd thought she'd found love in her golden years. Eric's public defender tried to argue that Margaret's death was genuinely accidental. That the blood thinner levels could be explained by medication error. That the oil on the stairs was circumstantial evidence. That an 8-year-old's testimony about pretend games wasn't reliable. But the prosecution had more than circumstantial evidence. They had a confession. They had financial records. They had medical experts who explained exactly how someone could commit murder using prescription medication. Most importantly, they had motive. Eric Johnson had a long history of targeting older women for financial gain. The prosecution brought in 3 previous victims who testified about his methods, his lies, his ability to make lonely women believe they were loved. He didn't kill Margaret Hayes for passion or anger, the prosecutor told the jury in closing arguments. He killed her for money. Cold, calculated, premeditated murder disguised as romance. She thought she was buying love. He was selling death. The jury deliberated for 6 hours. Guilty on all counts. Eric showed no emotion when the verdict was read. No tears, no outrage, no remorse. He sat in his orange jumpsuit and stared straight ahead, like a man watching TV. The judge sentenced him to life in prison without the possibility of parole, plus 25 years for the fraud charges. "Mr. Johnson," the judge said, "you didn't just kill Margaret Hayes. You killed her trust, her joy, her belief that people could be good. You took a woman who had survived poverty, widowhood, and heartbreak, and you turned her hope against her. There is no punishment severe enough for what you've done, but this court will ensure you never have the opportunity to do it again." Eric was transferred to Pochman Penitentiary, Mississippi's maximum security prison. He was 34 years old. If he lived to be 100, he would still die behind bars. He spent most of his time in protective custody, reading books and writing letters to women he found on prison pen pal websites. The letters were love letters, sympathy letters, requests for money and care packages. Even behind bars, Eric Johnson was still running the same con. Some of the women wrote back. "So what do you think? Was Margaret Hayes a victim of her own loneliness? Or was Eric Johnson just that good at manipulation? Could this have been prevented, or was Margaret doomed the moment she decided to look for love online?" Drop your thoughts in the comments below, and if this story hit you where it hurts, smash that like button and subscribe for more true crime stories that'll make you think twice about trusting strangers with your heart and your bank account. Because sometimes, the person who promises to love you forever is the same person planning to make sure forever comes sooner than you think. Stay safe out there. Trust your instincts. And remember, when something seems too good to be true, it usually is.